here with us for this important session. And really just want to thank the organizers again, pulling us all together. I know these are long days together. We're getting a lot of information. And so as a panel, we're going to do our best to do some opening remarks and then be able to open it for a conversation. Know that for many of us, this particular issue may feel like a new topic, but it's actually a critical topic that's in front of the G20 right now. Each of our panelists are going to speak about aspects of those decisions as well as the environment. But essentially, what climate finance means is getting the money to pay for climate mitigation and adaptation. Earlier today, we were talking about, many of us have talked about for a long time, Pope Francis has started to echo. But the idea that the North owes a debt to the South, a climate debt. And it's, could we get, I can't start, that won't work. Yeah. Okay. Can we, do people, can we turn that off? I'm not sure. People, or the Zoom, oh, is it for the Zoom? The bounce back? Yes. Thank you. But the idea, the concept that specifically the North owes a debt to the South, that much of the environmental degradation that the South has faced is a result of resources being taken from the South and used in the North. So it's one of the big messages that we have going into the Jubilee year. And one of the most important things in front of the G20 right now is to clearly define what climate finance means. And why that is critical is that we believe that the aid that countries need to deal with the impacts of climate change, that particular aid that they need should not be creating more debt. So we need to be very specific in terms of what $100 billion a year looks like a goal, or the G20's goal that's been reiterated of 1.3 trillion in additional resources by 2030. We need to be very clear and specific what climate finance means, what is coming in the form of grants, what is concessional aid or low interest loans, and what are going to be big loans from the private sector and others that will actually generate more debt. So the panelists will go into some of these areas more specifically, but I did want to raise the specific issues that the G20 is looking at right now in terms of climate finance. And this is important for us so we know where the dialogue is in the debate. Now, while all of these conversations on some level are taking place at a ministerial level for the finance ministers, as well as at the summit, the presidential prime minister level, some of the most important places that the climate finance discussions are taking place are in the working groups of the G20. So perhaps the most important is the G20 infrastructure group. And they are coming up with recommendations and proposals for how we get the climate finance we need. So COP29, the new climate finance goal, 1.8 trillion. That is needed, and so that's more investments. Previously, the new goal is 2.4 trillion that has been laid out to be achieved in terms of financing by 2030. Debt relief needs to be a part of that new goal. And one of the ways the G20 is specifically talking about it are debt swaps. So one of the speakers this morning talked about that idea, that concept of being able to protect the environment or use monies for climate mitigation and adaptation in exchange for debt relief. The other issue is climate and shock protection in debt contracts. So that's something that will come out in some of the finance minister communiques and others about how debt that's contracted through the state of New York or through London, the two world's largest financial jurisdictions, will have protections in their contracts for when a country can't pay back their loans because they're dealing with climate crisis and environmental shocks. The third area is debt sustainability assessments. Many of us are familiar with the old adage that the devil is in the details. In these very complicated assessments that the International Monetary Fund does, that the G20 has the majority of votes in, they are failing to factor in climate spending, climate challenges, as well as climate shocks. And that's something that the G20 is debating about a change. So the panelists will speak about some other areas, but those are three areas, or rather, I should say 4 areas: climate finance goal, debt swaps, climate and shock protection and debt contracts, and 4 debt sustainability assessments, where the G20 is actively having the conversation on climate. It's our belief and our power analysis that the most significant decisions will be made over the next 5 years on climate change, not by the United Nations, but by the G20 and the International Monetary Fund. And that's why it's so critical that we're gathering here, not by the United Nations, not by the COP. As important as those are for building consensus, the G20 will make some of the most significant climate change decisions for our lifetimes. So with that said, let me open it up for each of our panelists to offer some opening remarks. To my left is the Venerable Sadhvi, Bhagawati, Saraswati. Thank you. And to Sadhvi's left is Rabbi Aharon, Ariel, Lavi. I want to promote the rabbi's new book. Because I'm moderator, I got a copy, but it's on Jubilee. And as an economist and a rabbi, he's put a lot of thought into the demands of faith on these particular issues that we're talking about together. Just to check, do we have a representative from the Brazilian government who did come? I think that may be Cristina. No. So Emma, no. Thank you. And thanks to our organizers and producers in the back who are making everything run so smoothly. To my right is Carrick Reddin, the manager of Faith and Sustainability Initiative at the World Resource Initiative. And to his right is Dr. Katherine Marshall, the vice president of the G20 Interfaith Forum and executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue. So without further ado, why don't we start all the way to my left with Rabbi Aharon with the Torah Interfaith Center and the Blickle Institute for Interfaith Dialogue. Aharon.
Is this working? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm the managing director of the Torah Interfaith Center, but I also work with Adama, which is the largest Jewish environmental organization based in the United States. And our main goal is actually harnessing the Jewish world to engage with the climate crisis and do whatever it can about it. Now, I would start from maybe just to complicate the situation even more. We can get to the answers later, but just to make it even more complicated, and give you just one thought about the climate finance as it seems from this north-south tension that you mentioned. So, for example, one of the ways. Do I have to keep this pressed, or is this? Ah, okay. Now I can concentrate. Hands free. Okay. And also the mind is more free when your hands are not preoccupied. So when we talk about mitigation, about lowering carbon emissions, so some of it goes through the governments and what they need to do, but a lot of it is rolled back to the citizens or back to us, and there's like a ping pong. So for example, let's take one example and to sort of like crystallize my message. Let's take the example of international travel, which is a key contributor to carbon emissions. And all of us have traveled here, and I assume no one here lives in Brasilia per se, maybe a few of us, but we all came on airplanes. So one of the ideas that's out there on how to mitigate climate change and fund what needs to be done is to tax flights or tax fuel for flights, whatever, in any way you take it. At the end of the day, it's going to raise the cost of flights. The surplus will be used for financing some of the climate actions that need to happen, and it would also reduce the amount of flights. That's the theory. But I think that what's not taken into account, and I don't have the answer yet, I'm just trying to portray the complexity of the situation. What this doesn't take into consideration, and many of those steps that you mentioned need to be looked at this way, is like, what are the side effects, and who are the silent people who are going to be impacted by that. And for example, in this example, again, it's only one example out of many, there are about 80 countries in the world that depend on incoming tourism as their main source of income, their main growth engine. Almost all of them, I would say, are in the South, global South in general. Like the United States or France or Australia could get along with a few less tourists. But there are some countries that incoming tourism for them is the main source of income. And even more than that, the key reason they actually keep their rainforests or natural reserves or parks in South Africa is because these are sources of income. I was in South Africa 2 years ago and asked them, if we stop coming here as tourists to visit the amazing safaris, what's going to happen? They were very clear. They said, we're going to kill all the animals or sell them to zoos and bring cows for grazing. And cows will create even more methane and more carbon. So you can sort of like save on the flight side, but then you get huge repercussions of poverty and even more carbon emissions on the other side. And when we talk about debt swaps, debt sustainability, we need to think about what are the second and third and fourth grade impacts of that. Again, I don't have the answers yet. I'm not sure there are no simple answers to those complex problems. But I'm just trying to, as a first remark, just to encourage us to think about the complexity of those problems in a complex manner. And I think just to put the interfaith aspect into the mix, religions have a very long tradition of dealing with very, very complex issues in ways that make sense to a large extent. Issues of bioethics, issues of family, issues of the environment, issues of economics. And we can use those models, those ways of thinking, those patterns to maybe help us tackle those very complex issues that we face right now.
Thank you, Adam. And that was also, that was 3 minutes. So you really
No way.
got a lot in, but
Really?
we'll have more time for Q&A in a moment. Our next speaker, Sadhvi, is the Secretary General of the Global Interfaith Wash Alliance. Sadhvi.
It's so wonderful to be here. I would like to just begin by mentioning I am not an economist. I am not a finance expert. I am a religious renunciant, a monk, a nun, who spends most of her time engaged in social action, in development work. And I mention this in the beginning because I have a lot of thoughts which I will share on the topic, but I want to just preface it by the fact that this is not rooted in the science of finance or the system of finance, but it is rooted in an awareness that when you have people who have the expertise, I'm also not a technology expert, and yet when things need to be done, you have people who know how to work the technology and they make it work. All you need to do is make sure that their aims, their objectives, their intention, and their attention are focused in the right way. And then if they have the right technical skills, you're going to get whatever you need technically. We don't all have to be technicians. In the same way, I think that the role of faith, the role of religion, isn't necessarily so much for us all to try to emulate my respected brother here who is both an economy specialist and a rabbi, but to harness the power of that moral voice, that prophetic voice, to put in motion actions for those who do know how to work finance, who do know how to put the systems in place, giving them the direction such that the attention and intention takes us in the right direction. With that being said, I wanted to begin by mentioning that when the G20 was in India last year, the theme was Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, which literally means the world is a family. Here the theme is leave no one behind. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. Meaning is they're exactly synonymous. In a family, no one gets left behind. Could you imagine a situation in a family in which a member of the family needed an operation, but the family said, we're going to go to the movies instead? So sorry, can't pay for your medicine. So sorry, can't send you to school because, we've got a cruise vacation planned, or we're all going to the theater instead. It's inconceivable. You would say, not able to go on this vacation, not able to go to the movies because mom needs an operation, because this one needs to go to school, because this one needs medicine. We're very clear on what our priorities are, as long as they are our priorities. And this is really where I think the role of the interfaith world coming in is, what are our priorities? You cannot have security without sustainability. Where most of the money is going in so many of the nations with money is in security. And yet, you can protect the borders, but if we're dying on the inside, what is the benefit? You can protect the walls of your home, but if inside you've got a carbon monoxide leak or you've got black mold, what have you achieved? And we're in a situation today where so much of the money that we do have is being used under the name of quote unquote security to ensure that we have enough weapons and enough capacity to blow up the rest of the world, God knows how many times over, when there's only one world. And yet on the inside, we're suffering and dying, whether it's aspects of climate, whether it's pollution, whether it's so many other human rights issues. And so what's critical, I think, as we're looking at climate finance is, why is this not considered an emergency in such a way that all of the money gets put into fixing this, in the way that in a family, if a member of the family needed an operation or medicine, people intuitively and immediately would step up and understand that. It seems to me we speak a lot about economy, but we have to put the eco back in economy and understanding the interplay between climate, between ecology and economy. The other just last point to raise is that as we speak about finance, I think one of the critical issues is to realize that it's not only in the wealth that we have in our banks, but it's also in the wealth that we have in our clean water and our clean air and our clean soil, and that we need to start looking at wealth also in those areas and understanding that having clean air and clean water and clean soil for us and for our children and for future generations is, we have. That's okay. Welcome. Perfect time. No problem. And understanding the role that water plays, all over the world, people get up every morning and they go to work to make money so that their children can have an education, so that their children can have opportunities. And yet, if there isn't clean water to drink, if there isn't clean air to breathe, it doesn't matter what kinds of opportunities we give them, they're not going to be able to benefit from them. So to really understand as we're talking economy, the role of water, of air, of soil. And just the very last point in closing, as he was speaking about this idea of taxing flights and yet the negative repercussions around that, is that if you look at the role of animal agriculture, the meat industry, as our Honorable Mary Robinson spoke about this morning, the role of food. It is the meat industry is the single greatest contributor to the deforestation of the Amazon. Again, I won't go into all of the details, but before we look at taxing flights that are going to put the global south in dire circumstances that are going to have other really negative repercussions, let us look at making choices that actually have a huge impact upon both the finances as well as the environment itself.
Thank you, Sadhvi. And welcome, Cristina. Reis, you're here with the Brazilian government?
Yes.
Great.
Ministry of Finance.
Thank you for being here with us.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry that I'm so late.
No worries. We started a little bit late. It was the first time an event started late today. So, we'll go next to Catherine. Uh, to Carrick. Okay, we're gonna go next to Carrick. So with the World Resources Institute, Carrick.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know, World Resources Institute, WRI, is an NGO celebrating its 40th year, focused across many areas of sustainability and environment. Teams on cities, forests, water, food, across 13 countries, including WRI Brazil, based in Sao Paulo with over 100 staff. And specifically, I have the opportunity to work on WRI's Faith and Sustainability Initiative, which really strives to engage with faith-based organizations, religious actors in achieving goals and ultimately spurring action around people, nature, and climate. And I have to apologize because I will read quite a bit of notes specifically from other experts within WRI who have done much of the research on climate finance that ultimately informs negotiations in places like the G20 and at the COPs. And very grateful for the opportunity to be on the panel and aware that their expertise are going to be more informative for you all than me pontificating about issues for which I'm not an expert. And so forgive me as I do a bit of reading. But what I really want to emphasize here is a pressing need for climate finance to be both adequate and effective. There's really interconnected challenges around mobilizing sufficient resources, ensuring their equitable distribution, and maintaining robust accountability, all within a broader context of a polycrisis and urgent climate action. Some of the multifaceted challenges that I want to highlight include gender disparities. When we think about the significant gender gap in climate finance, we know that 60% of official development assistance for climate change includes gender equality as a significant objective, whereas only 2.4% targets it as a principal objective. There's also an alarming statistic from 2022, where of the $2.4 billion US channeled through civil society, only $43 million went to women-led organizations. Moreover, in 2014, only 2% of gender-responsive climate financing went to Southern civil society organizations, those in the global majority, and that number hasn't been calculated since. There's also a crisis around accountability. Despite the growing need for climate resilience, finance flows for adaptation have stagnated, with a 15% decline in 2021. Only one of the 42 key indicators needed to meet the Paris Climate Agreement are currently on track, which reflects a deeper issue, a lack of transparent participatory processes to ensure climate finance reaches those most in need. However, we at WRI see that faith-based organizations can play a critical role in addressing these challenges. There was a May 2022 joint appeal by global religious leaders calling for climate responsible finance as a moral imperative. Faith communities indeed are uniquely positioned to advocate for more equitable and accountable climate finance, ensuring that those resources are used to protect both the environment and vulnerable communities. There are 4 key elements of effective climate finance that we've identified, those being equity and inclusion, local empowerment, flexibility and predictability, and comprehensive monitoring and evaluation. And indeed, across all 4 of these elements, there are ways in which faith resource mobilization and accountability can go a long way. For example, faith-based organizations can contribute their resources, drawing on extensive networks and moral authority to advocate for increased climate finance, or even deploying their financial resources in that work. It includes advocating for wealthier nations to meet their commitments and ensuring that those resources are allocated in ways that prioritize equity and justice. Another way could be ensuring accountability. They could play a key role in ensuring that climate finance is used effectively and equitably, advocating for transparent and participatory decision-making processes and holding public authorities to account when commitments are not met. There's a need for holistic approaches to climate finance that integrate gender, accountability, equity, and local empowerment. Faith-based organizations have a critical role to play in this effort, ensuring that climate finance is mobilized effectively, distributed equitably, and used in ways that support the most vulnerable communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrick. And now let's move to Katherine.
The issues around climate finance are especially complex. We are working on a brief which will actually put onto the website that basically tries to explain all these different funds and the different negotiations. But basically what I have to say is I just go to Eric because he follows this on a day-to-day basis and he's much more familiar with which decisions are being made and where the negotiations stand. And of course, much better than either of us. But of course, the question that we're really addressing is what does the faith community have to do with it and what are the areas of potential? And then I'm going to finish with a quick story, which is what to me is one of the current dilemmas. So anyway, there are 4 areas that I see where faith communities can mobilize individually and collectively. And I think it's important to emphasize that it's at many different levels. There's Pope Francis, there's the patriarch, people arguing basically the moral voice, but also shaming, naming it. I guess that's moral as well, isn't it? Shaming people. At the global level, then there's very much the national level where as we say, strategy or policy is not what governments say, it's what they do. And the way you see what they do is in the budget. So the sort of advocacy for allocation of certain kinds of funding. So that's the sort of advocacy. And also it can get to a very, very local level where, in fact, a lot of things happen. We had a fascinating time in June spending time in Manaus and really coming to grips with the ways that global issues are echoed at a very local level. In terms of decisions people make and so forth. So advocacy. The second, which I think Carrick alluded to very briefly, is modeling. In other words, having faith communities doing the right thing, which includes these science-based emission targets. In other words, being more aware, more conscious, all sorts of other ways in which that can happen. I think the third, which has already been alluded to, is accountability. In other words, when there's an agreement, and even when there's a budget allocation, is it actually being implemented, and is it being implemented in ways that are honest, transparent? And there are increasing mechanisms that allow us to do that. They're very good sort of public-facing ways in which you can track budgets at different levels. And then the fourth is, which we haven't really mentioned very much, and that is resource mobilization. In other words, that faith communities actually contribute to this climate finance through different kinds of resources. So I think I would encourage anyone who's really interested to try to sort through what these different funds are, the Global Environment Fund and all these other funds, and where the negotiations stand, but also not to be afraid, not to be frightened by that, but to look at whatever level you are in, your institution, all of these dimensions. My story, which I'm going to end with, I think I have about a minute and a half. I think I can do it that. This took place at the Parliament of the World's Religions a few years ago, where there were, I was involved in organizing the program that was basically focusing on poverty alleviation. But there was a separate track that was dealing with climate and finance, which of course is part of the problem when you have the two separate. But we were friends. Mary Evelyn Tucker and I, we were talking, and we agreed, okay, towards the end, we should get together and have a conversation about our overlap, because we thought we shared exactly the same goals. But when we actually got together, we did not share the same goals at all. I mean, there was a sense, it's a question in a sense of priorities, that there was a sense among the climate people, everything else has to stop. And you have to, whereas with poverty, it's first of all, it's not going to happen. People are not going to stop development. And it's also profoundly unjust to leave aside the poverty program. So what we know is that we have to do both and. I mean, we have to find ways. But it is a serious tension now, where one of the concerns and the issues is that when organizations are reporting that they have increased dramatically their funding for climate, and I would put the organization I worked with for many years, the World Bank, into this category, the concern is that that's taking away from development programs. And so how do you judge? And to make it even more complex, there are surveys that have come out recently that suggest that among many countries, if they're asked their priorities, climate is about number 17. It is not necessarily the top of people's minds. Partly that's a question of definitions, but it's also a question of today's issues, priorities. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Katherine. And before we open it up, we're very pleased and grateful to have Cristina Reis from the Brazilian Finance Ministry with us. Cristina, we were with Finance Minister Haddad in Rome with Pope Francis in June, where he delivered very powerful remarks on the need for climate finance, as well as moving forward in a Brazilian presidency and future presidencies with the need to eradicate poverty. And the Holy Father lifted up the issues of debt relief, a new international bankruptcy process to end poverty and deal with environmental issues, sufficient economic aid to end poverty, and also getting all the money we need for climate mitigation and adaptation. And those remarks were echoed by the finance minister. So thank you for being here with us and joining us to share the leadership that the Brazilian presidency has right now.
Thank you. Have you all got your translation device or not? Should I? Well, I'll do it in English. My English is not perfect though.
Were we able to solve the translation issue? Okay. So would you prefer?
I would prefer to speak in Portuguese.
Please. Yes. We may need a few more. Okay. Yes.
Você tem uma maquininha aqui para frente, por favor?
Someone get me my. Oh, great. Yes, I had one here. Do you need? Yes. So the panel, I think everyone on the panel needs one.
Yes.
We're still working on our Portuguese, so. Okay. Oh, thank you, Emma. Yes, I know everyone thinks I speak Portuguese, but I actually don't.
Everybody ready? Espera mais um pouquinho.
Please, Cristina, thank you.
Muito obrigada para todos. Eu preferi falar em português, uma vez que eu represento o governo brasileiro, né, num evento no Brasil, então a gente costuma usar a nossa própria língua, mas a ideia aqui com a tradução, tenho certeza também que vai ser muito melhor do que o meu inglês, que não é um inglês perfeito. Bom, eu gostaria de agradecer muito o convite de participar desse evento, de participar dessa mesa. Mais uma vez, me desculpo pelo meu atraso. E minha missão aqui é trazer um pouco a visão do Brasil, da atitude do Brasil perante a presidência do G20, certo? E os tópicos mais importantes que estão sendo tratados nos grupos de trabalho, nas iniciativas ou nas forças-tarefas relacionadas a finanças climáticas. Então, como sabemos, na trilha financeira, dessa vez durante a presidência do Brasil, tem um grupo, uma força-tarefa nova, que é a mobilização global contra a mudança climática. Tem os trabalhos que continuam do grupo de trabalho de finanças sustentáveis, e houve também o lançamento de uma iniciativa em bioeconomia, que é nenhuma task force, não é nenhuma força-tarefa, nem um grupo de trabalho, mas é uma ideia nova que está em gestação, que o Brasil traz para as discussões internacionais. Eu vou fazer um resumo, dado, né, que os 5 minutos, mas nesses 3 grupos, temas muito importantes que têm a ver com a discussão que está sendo feita aqui, se relacionam à transição justa. Então, como as finanças climáticas ou sustentáveis podem ocasionar e devem deflagrar a transição justa, e o que significa, né, para esses diversos países a justiça climática e ambiental. O redirecionamento dos fundos climáticos, destravar os fundos climáticos para que eles realmente tragam projetos para esse desenvolvimento sustentável. E aí já eu vou fazer uma palavra sobre a sua fala final, Katherine, que traz um pouquinho essa contraposição que está ocorrendo entre o financiamento climático e o do desenvolvimento. Outra ideia que está lançada nesses grupos é o desenvolvimento de princípios de alto nível sobre o que é a bioeconomia ou as bioeconomias, entendendo bioeconomia de uma forma mais geral, em que cada país tem a sua visão soberana de bioeconomia e a sua relação dos povos, das pessoas com a natureza. E a gente sabe que essa relação das pessoas com a natureza passa muito pela cultura, passa pela religião, passa pela moralidade, pela ética. Então, acho que esse aqui é um ponto de atenção importante. E na força-tarefa de clima, está sendo feito um mapeamento de como finanças climáticas estão sendo tratados em todos os grupos das 2 trilhas do G20, não somente a financeira, mas também a diplomática, porque esses temas acabam se cruzando. E vai sair dali uma declaração, assim como saiu no grupo, né, da mobilização da Aliança Global contra a Fome, uma declaração conjunta também em favor dessas finanças climáticas. E aí a ideia, trazendo também um pouco a fala da Saraswati aqui, é que seja colocado nesses fóruns a visão do Sul Global de que desenvolvimento passa necessariamente pela redução de desigualdades. Desigualdades de renda, desigualdades de riqueza, desigualdades também entre os diferentes trabalhos executados pelas pessoas e a remuneração que eles geram e a percepção e a valorização cultural que eles têm. E para tratar das desigualdades, então, é preciso olhar para as interseccionalidades, para as diferenças entre homens e mulheres, pessoas de raças e etnias diferentes, as desigualdades entre regiões, entre territórios, E o olhar do Brasil é muito preocupado com o território. Não há discussão de bioeconomia sem olhar para o território, por exemplo, né, para as finanças climáticas. Então, entender que essa pauta climática é para nós no Brasil, para o Ministério da Fazenda, e aqui falando pelo Plano de Transformação Ecológica, que é uma prioridade do Ministério, essa transformação é muito mais forte do que simplesmente uma transição. Nós temos que fazer uma mudança de paradigma tecnológico, produtivo, financeiro e cultural, de modo de vida, e que essas desigualdades são reduzidas e, por que não, dirimidas, e a gente busque a paz e a prosperidade. E aqui eu vou me dar o direito de usar essa palavra, porque eu sei o valor que tem para todos presentes a paz. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Cristina. Emma, I'm assuming even though we started late, we're still ending at 6, right? And everyone needs a little break before the environmental minister comes tonight in any case. So we have a full half hour for discussion. Thank the moderator. No, thank our amazing speakers who were very concise, to the point, and right on to allow us to have a conversation. Could I invite 3 questions from the audience for the panel to begin? So 1, 2, and 3. I'd ask you to introduce yourself and keep your question as brief and concise as possible.
My name is Fred Kruger from San Francisco. Why do we emphasize climate finance just at the governmental level and not at the religious congregation level or the individual level? For instance, in America, it's about we have about 18 tons per capita responsibility, but that only means planting a dozen trees because each tree sequesters 1.5 tons over 30 years, costs about $5 a tree. There's an opportunity for a whole different approach to climate finance.
Thank you.
My name is Vera Solovyeva. I'm originally from Siberia, from Siberia, Republic of Sakha-Yakutia, that's located in northeastern part of Russia. But now I'm reside in United States, and I recently defended in climate change field, where I'm studying that indigenous knowledge and how indigenous knowledge can contribute to successful adaptation strategies for climate change. And here I have a question, because like I'm indigenous myself. I work with indigenous people, and I see how climate change actually impact their life. And I know that's like a climate that their knowledge can contribute to successful adaptation strategies. However, there are no finance help in Russia before, and now even more war situation. Nobody care about our people. So what to do in this kind of way? Can find support and help and some financial probably funding or something? This is very practical question. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final.
Thank you very much. I'm Muhsin Sihab from Indonesia, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's more like a comment rather than a question. For Indonesia, of course, the perspective of climate finance is shaped by the status of Indonesia as developing countries, which is also vulnerable to climate change and need for sustainable development. And for that reasons, we have several principles that we would like to call upon religious leaders to also voice out these principles. The principles itself, firstly, it's about equity and responsibility. And it may sound cliche about common but differentiated responsibilities. And these need to be emphasized. And secondly, about the access and flexibility. I mean, the importance of accessible and flexible climate finance mechanism is of crucial importance. Because it has to be responsive to specific vulnerabilities. Different countries may have different situations and different vulnerabilities. So it has to be responsive to its respective situation. And transparency and accountability, I fully agree with what Catherine's mentioned about the robust monitoring, and religious leaders in this aspect can play a very pivotal role. And lastly, it's about balance allocation between mitigation and adaptation aspects. And for that reason, also religious leaders, I think, need to be equipped with general overview about the climate change situation. Because faith-based communities can play a significant role in raising awareness, educating people, and as a faith-based organizations also can play a very significant role in mobilizing finance, like endowments, finance, charitable actions, and some other similar actions. For Indonesia, I would like to share our best practices. Probably this is
Great. Can
because
I ask you to be brief? We only
yes,
have about 20 minutes
we
left.
have Islamic green finance. Islamic green finance, which integrates the principles of Islamic teachings and also environment situation. So we work together in multi-stakeholders partnership, religious leaders, bankers, and philanthropists and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So 2 questions and a comment to begin for the panelists to respond to, and then we should be able to do one more round of questions. The first question to the panel is, how do we look at climate finance in terms of a local responsibility, in terms of a religious, congregational, or individual responsibility? How do we look at that in that sense? What is our responsibility? The second question that we heard specifically raised about the reality that there is deep indigenous wisdom that can help us with some of these questions. How do we utilize that wisdom, but also how do we find the resources to support that wisdom and those kinds of solutions coming from indigenous communities? And finally, our friend from the Indonesian Foreign Ministry raising a number of religious principles that we can comment on. And in particular, the last item that you mentioned, which is certainly of interest, and Indonesia, I hope, is bringing it up in the G20 and in other circles, but the wisdom of Islamic finance, which looks at capping interest rates and ensuring that money is used for positive purposes. So let me turn that back to our panel, but also remind our panel as you address these questions, we're also really trying to make as many connections to the G20 as possible. So Katherine, could I ask you to start, and I ask each panelist to comment or respond to how they would like, but 2 minutes from each panelist, then we'll do one more round of questions.
In my very rough 4 points that I was emphasizing, the advocacy, which is partly education, etc., modeling, accountability and resource mobilization. Point 4 is very much what Fred is talking about, which is that the faith community should not only be looking to public sector allocations, but can also mobilize and as well show as examples. And the Islamic finance is one example. The Faith Invests, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility is doing a lot with using the resources that faith communities have, which is billions and billions of dollars. Frankly, we have no idea how many billions, but lots of them, that they can use their investment power, they can use their mobilization and as well as their example to have the most positive influence, which does then take us to the point of where should the investments be going? I mean, and how do you balance these questions between development and climate mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage? I mean, how much of the resources are being channeled away from basic development? It's a real question, partly a question of perception, because that's the way a lot of people see it, but it's also a real tension in many situations.
Thank you, Katherine. Carrick.
Thanks. So Fred, I think to your point, it's very sound, and what I can share is WRI worked with Georgetown actually on developing a science-based targets for faith methodology. WRI developed science-based targets for corporations to be able to benchmark their emissions and develop evidence-based strategies for their reduction in line with the Paris Agreement and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And then we developed one specific to faith communities and congregations, and that allows faith actors to be able to see what their emissions are and then develop strategies in order to address those through more sustainable management of their assets and climate action. And so I encourage you to check those out. There's a lot of strategies there, a lot of really good people on the ground doing that movement work. And the idea for this next phase would be to include Scope 3 emissions, which includes emissions related to financial assets and investments. And there, I think in that opportunity, there is really that chance to think about how we can be targeting faith-owned finance for climate impact. And then Vera, I think to your point, I want to relate to what Cristina shared about the bioeconomy initiative. WRI Brazil, in partnership with a number of national research institutions, developed a report called The New Economy for the Brazilian Amazon, which essentially showed that ending deforestation and maintaining the standing forest would not curb development in the Brazilian Amazon, but would instead be an opportunity to create jobs, to protect nature, to improve local lives, and to keep the world's climate goals within reach. And much of that research was done thanks to the wisdom of indigenous peoples and other traditional communities and the ways in which they have stewarded those lands and shown that that can be something that both improves human livelihoods and protects nature. And so with that work, and I think other work that we're trying to engage in bringing finance that often goes more to institutions like WRI than to local organizations, and trying to think about how we can be best intermediaries or just allow for direct giving of climate finance to local defenders, indigenous peoples, and other local communities. It's extremely important work that I'm happy to talk about the networks that are already doing it. I'm sure you're already doing it, but I think we need more of it.
Thank you. Cristina.
Bom, muito obrigada pelas perguntas. Thank you very much for your questions. A minha resposta vai na linha do que o Carrick acabou de falar. Realmente, a iniciativa de bioeconomia traz inspirações muito interessantes. Eu tenho certeza que vocês gostariam de acompanhar os debates, principalmente quando olha para o território, como eu vinha falando, e como valorizar tanto os conhecimentos tradicionais dos povos tradicionais, dos indígenas, de cada um dos países, né, que são diferentes, esses povos tradicionais, mas ao mesmo tempo a altíssima tecnologia de vanguarda que tem a ver com biotecnologia, com o uso da biomassa, a biomanufatura, que são esses setores do futuro. Então, tem um equilíbrio aqui interessante a ser encontrado, mas que traz oportunidades econômicas para essas comunidades. E aí eu acredito que também as lideranças religiosas em seus territórios podem trabalhar nesse sentido da mudança, né, cultural e de comportamento com relação à produção, ao consumo, ou melhor dizendo, todas as atividades relacionadas à circulariedade econômica, né, a economia circular. Então, uma percepção mais sustentável, e aqui já respondendo também um pouquinho que foi dito pelo membro do Ministério de Foreign Affairs da Indonésia, a dimensão da sustentabilidade pode e deve ser valorizada para além do que é verde, né? E aqui verde é a minha cor preferida, tá? Eu sou filha de Oxóssi, mas a gente vem falando em blue economy também, outras economias, e tem que sempre, para os países em desenvolvimento, incorporar a dimensão social. Por isso, nos planos de governo, a gente tem usado a palavra sustentável, pensando tanto na questão ambiental e climática, como na questão da inclusão social, junto, né? Então, a ideia de sustentabilidade nesse sentido para as ações de financiamento climático. Então, resumindo, essa também ponderação entre o nível local e o nível regional, nacional, internacional ou interregional um pêndulo difícil de se fazer para a política pública, né, e para as discussões que vêm no G20, mas ela é absolutamente necessária, porque, de fato, a falta de um olhar para o local, para a territorialidade, tem sido uma das explicações da baixa eficiência dessas políticas com relação à redução de desigualdades.
Thank you, Cristina. Aharon? Or Sadhvi? I'm just going to go.
Okay. I'll try to squeeze this into 2 minutes. First of all, thank you for all the ideas and the questions. I think that the key question is, how do we make religion part of the solution and not part of the problem? And I very agree with your points, Catherine, and what you raised. If I try to distill this, the question is, what is the comparative advantage of religions and religious communities when it comes to climate finance? And I think when you talk about the G20, what can we bring to the table that no one else can? Because I'm an economist, but I can just go there as an economist. I don't need to be a rabbi for that. What's our comparative advantage in this discussion? And I think that our main advantage is really building communities and changing behavior. I think that religions have proven ability over millennia to build communities and change behavior. And that's one, and I think this catches a lot of also what you said, Catherine. And I would add on top of that a holistic approach, which to say that we can feed two birds with one grain. For example, what you offered earlier about veganism, or at least reducing the amount of meat consumption. I've been vegan for 26 years now, so I totally sympathize with that. But as opposed to the example with flights, so reducing meat consumption has actually positive side effects in health, in morality, and in many other aspects besides just the carbon emissions. So we need to find solutions like that, and those are areas where religions can actually change behavior, build communities around those new ideas, or old ideas actually, and just renew them and bring them to the fore. And I think that's one main thing. Now, in relation to what our colleague from Indonesia said about public policy, because religion also has a lot to say about public policy and big ideas. So I think there actually, I agree that ideas such as Islamic financing and Jewish financing, all that can play a role. There's a lot to say about that. We don't have enough time right now. But I think that here, I actually disagree with you. We should be very wary and careful with this comparison between family and nation, or family and entire humanity. Some mechanisms work great for families, but they do not work in large scales, and vice versa. In Jewish law, we have several concepts that deal with that, with the transition between a family and priorities in a family, and then priorities what happens when you go to a larger scale, where the amount of trust and acquaintance and knowledge about all the actors is not the same as in a family. So we can't do exactly the same because it will lead to distortions in the system. There are ways to deal with that, but just to summarize in one small idea, while we do need to prioritize and invest in what's important, we cannot subject all of our resources just to that. So, for example, we want to invest in climate change, doesn't mean that we're going to stop doing anything about gardening or arts or culture or other things that are less important. They seem so, but no, it's because in a holistic approach, yes, you need also public gardens and culture, and you can't just wipe all development, as Katherine said. You can't just wipe all of that out for the sake of combating climate change. So it's always complex.
Sadhvi.
So, first of all, with regard to the concept of actual finance from the role of religious organizations, as a religious organization that does not have billions of dollars, but that is very well connected to people, one of the things that we've done a lot of is India has something called CSR, which is corporate social responsibility, which is a requirement that corporations donate a certain amount of their money to social projects. And from a perspective of being a religious organization and a respected one, a revered one, a trusted one, being able to help channel CSR funds from corporations into programs and projects like cleaning the Ganga River, filtering the water from the sewers that are entering into the river so that the river stays clean, massive scale tree plantation programs, and so many other programs around that area. So just to put that out there, that it's not exclusively a matter of the money that each organization has itself, but also the power of religion as a trusted place for people with faith who are businesses, who are corporations, and to help channel that money into these areas. The other piece I wanted to respond to that's been raised by several people very beautifully with regard to individual responsibility and that duty that we have. Cristina mentioned lifestyle. And I think one of the critical pieces here is business runs on a supply and demand foundation. And to the extent that our faith informs what we are demanding, it is therefore impacting that which is being supplied. And far too frequently today in the world, we have price tags on items that has nothing to do with the actual ripple impact upon the world. So we have an economic model in much of the world that is based on more, cheaper, cheaper, cheaper. And we look at the price tag as though that is all the cost without recognizing how did it get so cheap? And are there women and children working in sweatshops? Or are the employees being oppressed and repressed? Or are the cotton fields being filled with chemicals that are giving cancer to the farmers and their children have birth defects? Or are the factories that are producing these items cutting corners and therefore their waste is spewing into the air, into the water, into the soil? And really demanding a conscious living, as I've been speaking about, with regard to what we eat, yes, but also what we wear. Fashion is a huge component to water pollution in the world. So much of what we buy being produced in factories, and the demand for conscious consumption, doing our homework, finding out which companies, and therefore as religious bodies, helping our congregations using our power of impact and influence to say, hey, you need to buy in this way, dress in this way, eat in this way, not because we're telling you from just a dogmatic standpoint, but from the perspective of equality and environmental protection and climate and poverty alleviation. And these are the things that are harming our sisters and brothers across the world, because what we each consume and purchase has such a huge ripple impact, from food to everything produced in factories worldwide.
Thank you, Sadhvi. I think we have time for 2 more questions, very brief questions, and then for our panelists to make closing remarks. So 1 and 2. Thank you.
Can I make my question in Portuguese?
Yes.
Okay, let me just speak to you. Então, meu nome é Tainara, eu faço parte da Caritas Brasileira, que é uma organização ligada à CNBB, né, Conferência Nacional dos Bispos. E a minha pergunta, na verdade, vai um pouco no sentido da emergência climática. Há pouco mais de 2, 3 meses, o Brasil viveu uma de suas maiores emergências climáticas no Rio Grande do Sul, e nesse exato momento que a gente fala que agora a Amazônia, que é um manancial de água, vive uma emergência de seca. Então, como que a gente aborda a questão da, não só questão climática, mas da emergência climática e da resposta climática dentro do fórum do G20, né? E também conectado ao nosso fórum aqui da fé, né? Porque o que acontece? Organizações de fé, elas são organizações que chegam aonde muitas vezes o governo não chega, a defesa civil não chega, em respostas humanitárias e respostas de emergência. Então, como a gente conecta não só a temática climática, mas sim de emergência climática, né? Estamos caminhando sem querer, não querendo ser assim, né? Como se diz, olhando pelo lado ruim, mas estamos caminhando para cada vez mais desastres socioambientais. Então, como a gente aborda isso dentro do fórum e também conectado às nossas comunidades de base e de fé? Obrigada.
Thank you. One last brief question.
Thanks. I'm going to frame what I'm about to say in a negative, so forgive me for a second. I don't think I came to Brasilia to hear speeches about how we should do more work on advocating for the environment. I came here because I was hoping to get inspiration from people who are doing practical things, who have policy relevant conclusions and suggestions that we can actually take to higher level leaders. My question is, why do we get trapped into only taking the really big level questions up the chain? When we think of G20, we only want to talk about big policy issues, billions of dollars. And I'm sitting here with a proposal on my phone from a hospital on the banks of the Nile in Uganda that says, we've noticed that we've had a lot more flooding from the Nile of late. They don't call it climate change, to Catherine's point. It's just we've had a lot more flooding and we need some help digging trenches around and doing infrastructure improvements. Do you know where we can find $10,000 for that?
Wow.
And that's a practical thing. I'm looking for small things. I'm not looking for billions of dollars. I'm looking for small things. 25 years ago, last month, I sat with a group of farmers in a diocese in rural Tanzania in what became the beginning of the TIST program, TIST.org, if you want to ever look it up. TIS, to my brother's comment from San Francisco here, what can a congregation do? So in this one diocese, they started small groups planting trees, and here we are 25 years later, 200,000 farmers are keeping 23 million trees alive in India, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and they're planting more every day. You can go onto their website and track down all of the trees because they have them all GPS plotted. Why? Because they're getting greenhouse gas credits for them now. Subsistence farmers are actually getting this. That thing started because somebody put in a couple $100,000 out of his pocket to get this thing up and running. Somebody at Dow Chemical, who was my bunkmate in this house that we stayed in, worked at Dow Chemical and got $1 million from them to help put in to help get this thing really going. Here we are 25 years later, 23 million trees. These are practical things, and that's what I want the world to see is success upon success. How do we tell that small story? Thank you.
Great. I'm sorry we have no more time for any more questions because we do have to end. And I want each of our panelists to be able to make closing remarks. So the two questions that were lifted, specifically, how do we harness or utilize the faith voice constructively to deal with the issues around the environment and bring it to the G20? So how can we harness that? And the next question we heard, it has to do with, I think, how do we also lift and focus local solutions, even though the G20 is focused globally and on the macroeconomic questions, raising that. So I think if each of the panelists wants to take a moment, you can either respond to that or make closing comments. It's up to you. And Cristina, if you will allow me, I'd like to ask you a separate question. And I think many of us, we began by talking about one of the most important initiatives of the G20 right now is helping to define what climate finance means. So that real aid and grants are getting to deal with these problems as opposed to high private sector debt. So we'd love to hear more about where that conversation is at within the G20 now. Can we start with Aharon? And just about a minute for everyone to wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just take 2 sentences. The Jewish, I think, Katherine Mead, she said in the 1950s, she said, don't ever doubt the power of small communities to change the world, because in reality, that's the only thing that ever has. That's our competitive advantage. As religious leaders, we know how to build communities and change behavior. Let's take that, leverage that. As you said about successes, small stories, one story adds to another and becomes a huge impact. And that's what we can bring to the table and really change the world.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Yeah, I want to just re-quote what I had quoted this morning from Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, who had said, there's always enough for everyone's need and never enough for anyone's greed. We have the resources. We know we have the resources. What we need to do as faith leaders and faith communities is to continue to ensure that the attention, intention, and focus of those resources is going in alignment with our values and our priorities and our ethics, and that includes poverty alleviation, and it includes protecting the very home that we live in. And these successes and these stories are that which bring inspiration, but to continue to inspire people, whether on a small scale level or on a large scale level, to use whatever resource they have, whatever time and talent and technology they have, for everyone to be a part of the solution.
Thank you. Katherine.
The first question reminded me of a comment that we heard while we were meeting in Manaus in June, which is that someone said that, well, with 84% of the world's population having a religious affiliation and all these very noble goals, why do we have problems? In other words, people are not necessarily following their religious teachings. So I think this function of education and helping people really to appreciate the level of the emergency in ways that then translate into votes and action at a personal level is clearly one of the priorities. Doug, I'm delighted you came, even though maybe the trillions, we're talking about billions to trillions. I do think that we need to think maybe a little bit more clearly about our different platforms. And the G20 platform is about emergencies. and it is about global level action. That's for better or for worse. The global leaders are probably not going to be interested in your Ugandan Nile project per se. They're looking for scale and they're looking for impact. But there are other platforms where we can do that. And I'm very conscious of that because in some of the work we're doing on strategic religious engagement, the main gap that we're seeing is not utilizing, not benefiting from, not engaging with religious people at the community level, whether it's for social protection or basically understanding education problems. So I think that there is a huge area for these very micro investments and the multiplier effect. And the stories can make an impact in the G20 context. But I think we have to realize that there are macro issues, and that's the G20 reality.
Thank you, Katherine. Carrick.
Thank you. I think, Tainar, to your point about this sort of being a climate emergency, it's an important one and one that we ought to continue to sound. And I think it really necessitates a holistic approach to deploying climate finance and really taking any sort of action, and one, to pull from Cristina's words, that involves the addressing of inequalities in a way that is intersectional of gender, race, territory, and other aspects. For example, disaster relief that's not just about responding to the disaster, but also is promoting environmental and social co-benefits, because we really can't afford to make investments that are only addressing one issue. And I think faith communities, with the trust they have with local communities, have an opportunity to inform those kind of holistic solutions and hold to account those investments. And then, Doug, I appreciate the sort of push for local and practical solutions. And I think climate finance, when well deployed and equitably distributed, should be able to provide that kind of funding to hospitals to support adaptation that is supporting social and environmental outcomes. And I think we also might want to consider more opportunities for devolution so that we're empowering local governments, civil society organizations, particularly women-led organizations and other grassroots organizations, to manage and allocate climate finance in ways that respond to local needs and priorities.
Thank you, Carrick. And finally, Cristina.
Obrigada. Eu vou começar pela pergunta que foi feita para mim. Oh, we'll wait. Sorry. We'll wait for you to. Yeah? Ok. Eu vou começar com a sua pergunta, feita para mim, porque ela me ajuda também a responder as outras. De fato, definições no G20 são sempre complicadas. Dizer o que é transição justa, o que é desenvolvimento sustentável, o que é finanças climáticas, o que é bioeconomia. Desperta muitas paixões, porque os conceitos e entendimentos, principalmente de povos diferentes, se num país já é diferente, imagina se a gente considerar numa escala planetária, né? Mas a gente vem caminhando para, eu acho que trabalhar principalmente os instrumentos das finanças climáticas, né? Tradicionalmente, finanças climáticas são entendidas como aquelas que promovem a mitigação, ou seja, ajudam a reduzir a quantidade de gás carbono ou de equivalente de efeito estufa na atmosfera e que tem causado a mudança climática, quanto de adaptação, que é o que é necessário para fazer, quais são os investimentos necessários para os dispêndios que a mudança climática traz, como os desastres naturais, as catástrofes climáticas ambientais. Mas nós estamos caminhando no G20 para uma visão mais de sustainable finance, né, que olha para a sustentabilidade, que olha para as questões sociais, como o Carrick estava colocando, para as questões ambientais e também econômicas, porque a transformação da estrutura produtiva é necessária para que consigamos, então, ter esses padrões de consumo, padrões de produção, padrões de circularidade, reciclagem, reuso, de acordo com uma maior harmonia entre a atividade humana e a natureza. E aí, esses instrumentos eu vou me permitir falar, porque aí traz um pouco a ideia dos planos micro e macro, do território e do global, do nacional, porque eles estão há instrumentos para essas diferentes unidades analíticas, né? Então, a gente vem falando em perdão da dívida ou alívio da dívida, é uma questão fundamental a ser tratada, apesar de delicada, porque muitos países pobres não conseguirão fazer os investimentos para a transição climática se não tiver a sua dívida perdoada. É simplesmente impossível, é um cálculo matemático, né? Também a tributação de grandes fortunas tem sido colocada como uma prioridade no G20 por causa da enorme desigualdade entre as pessoas, né? Entre também corporações, e aí a ideia de redistribuir isso de uma maneira que contribua para o meio ambiente, como algumas propostas que estão na mesa, pode ser uma solução interessante. Outros instrumentos que têm sido enfatizados são os títulos sustentáveis, os títulos de gênero, os títulos de transição justa, os títulos soberanos, como o que o Brasil lançou, sustentável, que vão canalizar recursos para esses investimentos. No caso, por exemplo, dos títulos soberanos sustentáveis brasileiros, os recursos estão indo tanto para o Fundo Clima, que é um fundo gerido pelo Ministério do Meio Ambiente, operacionalizado pelo Banco Nacional de Desenvolvimento, para que as indústrias consigam fazer esse investimento em tecnologia para descarbonizar, quanto poderia ir também para programas como Bolsa Família, de transferência, Cash Transfer Programs, que vão ali aliviar a pobreza, sendo que a pobreza vem como prioridade no G20 para o Brasil, porque é uma questão estrutural gigantesca que não pode ser esquecida enquanto se debate clima, né? Então, essas questões estão intrinsecamente interrelacionadas. Outros instrumentos para ainda terminar assim, nessa explicação aqui mais completa são as soluções baseadas na natureza ou serviços ecossistêmicos, serviços ambientais, que podem trazer aí benefícios para o território, como a gente vinha falando, em escala menor, mas que, se somados, são gigantescos. Então, no caso dos biomas brasileiros, que são 6, mas do Pantanal, do Cerrado, da Amazônia, soluções ecossistêmicas para além do carbono, mas pensando, por exemplo, em recursos hídricos, conservação da cultura, etc., são absolutamente necessárias e elas vão ter uma escala menor. Mas o financiamento pode ser em escala macro, como a Katherine falou, né? Então, essa discussão de fundos internacionais para esses financiamentos, inclusive, que é o problema raiz para países em desenvolvimento, com proteção ao risco cambial, ou que sejam feitos em moeda local para evitar a volatilidade das taxas de câmbio, que é comum em países mais pobres, é essencial. E todas essas discussões estão no G20. E, por fim, tem uma agenda regulatória enorme, uma agenda regulatória de novos mercados. Vai passar pelo mercado de carbono, por exemplo, vai trazer que a gente está buscando implementar no Brasil, a taxonomia, que é aquilo que vai definir, afinal, o que é sustentável. Qual atividade econômica é sustentável? Qual ativo, qual projeto de investimento? Então, nós temos que ter um entendimento comum e a taxonomia vem para esse propósito. E, para terminar, ainda no Sustainable Finance Working Group, a gente tem as discussões sobre os planos de transição corporativos, então, como as empresas, principalmente as grandes empresas, estão planejando a sua transição climática, e os relatórios de sustentabilidade, né, que tem a ver o que a Saraswati trouxe no caso indiano, né, o CSR é essa questão que tem uma possibilidade de investimento aqui para a pauta que a gente chama de ESG, ela traz um novo caminho, né? Então, implementar relatórios de sustentabilidade, implementar planos de transição e a regulação do Sistema Nacional Financeiro pode abrir essas oportunidades. Então, eu acho que são discussões essenciais para serem feitas entre países com um compartilhamento, inclusive, de melhores práticas. Então, eu acho que nesse caminho, que é um caminho necessário de olharmos conjuntamente para as possibilidades, é claro que tem pautas mais prioritárias, mais essenciais, que vão lá no coração do sistema financeiro internacional, né? Mas também há aquelas que trazem impactos de escala menor que vão fazer diferença para muitas pessoas. E é esse equilíbrio que a gente busca sempre com a política pública.
Thank you so much, Cristina, and thanks for also doing my job in summing up the panel as well, as we have to get going. But first, we'd like to thank Emma and the production crew, the translators. They've really been working hard, and the small breaks between sessions, they're working the whole time to get ready for us. So thank you guys for everything that you're doing. Really want to thank all of you for being here with us today, and for the questions that you brought to this important discussion. And finally, want to thank our panelists, Katherine, Carrick, Cristina, Sadhvi, and Aharon, who not only the breadth and depth of what they shared was truly incredible. I want to thank you because it's not often I moderate a panel where people are very concise with their thoughts. So thank you, because that allowed half of our time to go for conversation. So as we close, I would invite the panelists to stay just for a moment so we can get a group picture together before you move on. I want to remind everyone at 6:30, the Environmental Minister of Brazil will be speaking in our main plenary room, so you won't want to miss that. Thank you for being with us. Thanks to our panel. Thanks to our crew.
Thanks to our